My name is Joey Williams. I run the cities work for IPPO, and welcome to our recording of our event on urban recovery plans we held in collaboration with the Greater London Authority and the London Research and Policy Partnership. This event was an opportunity to bring together city leaders and thinkers from across the world to share their insights for successful and sustainable recovery. The recording of the event begins now with the first presentation from Professor Ben Rogers from the University of London.
Most important headings. But clearly illness and death. And if you remember, in the early days of the pandemic, there was a sort of widespread assumptions apparently borne out by the evidence that the pandemic was going to hit cities particularly hardly just because people are close to each other in cities. I think over time that proved not to be the case, or at least the sort of the effect of cities was much less important than the effect of differences in health, work and living conditions and in vaccine take-up. Social isolation, clearly another effect. Here again, there wasn't an obvious cities penalty. Public finances, lost revenue, business and income support, health spending, a big blow, but something which we could certainly have managed. And I hope we return to the status quo ante. But the fourth effect, and I think the one which is most sort of specific to cities, and in some ways the most profound, is the effect on our work and consumption habits, and the way we got used to and discovered we could live relatively remotely from one another, or at least many of us could. So that's what I want to talk about a bit more today. What I sometimes call is the remote economy, and the effect that could have on the future of urban life. So his cities are all about reducing the cost of human connection by bringing people together, and that really is just a sort of fundamental law of urban life. I mean, it's a bit like evolution through adaptation. It just explains everything you want to know about cities, all the good things about them, their efficiency, their sustainability, their creativity, and all the downsides, congestion, contagion, fire, and everything. It's all about bringing people together. But even before the pandemic, digital technologies were making it easier for us to live and work and shop apart, and we were beginning to see changing work habits. I know from London, in the case of London, the fare box of TfL was declining. People were often taking Friday to work at home. But I think that the way this was really clear was in the increasing rows of empty shops, and closed down restaurants in many city centres. But suddenly during the pandemic, these trends which were already in place began to look pretty existential. This was the Onion, satirical the US Satiricals magazine's take on this. They envisaged endangered white rhinos flooding into the streets of New York. And again, if you remember, sort of 2 years ago, everyone was really worrying about whether this was the end of urban life as we knew it. And I remember my children who never shown any interest in anything I do, sort of saying to me, "Dad, is this the end of London?" And that thought was around. I think it's clear now that some of these worries were hugely exaggerated. But I think it's also clear that some of these behaviours that we've adapted will stick and with potentially profound implications for urban life. This is just a graph looking at what's gone on in remote retail or online shopping. We've seen it moving back up again from back down again from its highs during the pandemic, but nevertheless it seems to be at a higher level than it was before, and I think everything suggests that online shopping is going to continue to increase, though it does vary hugely from country to country. But I think the big one is remote working. It seems to me that some sort of blended model will become much more the norm. This is a survey just asking employers and business leaders whether they think blended work is here to stay, and the large majority of them do. As Jeff says, it's different in different cities, and it does depend a bit on the sort of culture of work, but certainly in cities like London, New York, across the West, we're moving to a sort of much more blended work model. And it's clear, as I've said, that these developments could pose profound challenges for cities. And I've just got 2 slides left. So one is about sort of challenges. Hollowed out city centres, we've been seeing some of that already, high streets with vacant shops and so on. Less demand for city living. I mean, there is some evidence that people are using the rise of remote working to relocate, and with consequences for sprawl and car dependency. Clearly, the disruption to retail and hospitality businesses with unemployment that could follow, a surge in urban freight and delivery services, as part of the sort of, on-demand economy. Declines in public transport fare income, a very real threat in a city like London, but also in New York. The mayor of London is consulting on the biggest cuts to bus services we've ever seen, just because the pandemic has left public finances in such a deplorable state, and it's unlikely that we will see in the short term a return to the usage we were seeing before. A decline in city and business taxes, and something which isn't talked about very much, but I think is really important, which is increased segregation, because actually, for the most part, our work lives are much more integrated than our domestic and social lives. So this is something I think we should be thinking about more, but increased segregation. And those are the challenges. And I just turn lastly just to some of the opportunities, more sustainable travel patterns. I mean, there was something extremely inefficient in the way that we sort of, we use the city to travel into work every day, leaving our homes empty, and so on. And there is an opportunity through remote working to reduce congestion, pollution, and carbon emissions, potentially the revival of local economies. And we've seen some of that in London as workers spend more time at home. Big opportunities around actually a more sustainable, more creative, more resilient mix of use, particularly in city centres. Cities are all about mix. We can perhaps do that more now than we could in the past, with the end of community and dormitory suburbs and business-focused city centres. City centres moving up what I call the value chain. So actually, you come into a city centre where you use it for something meaningful, not just as a place to sit behind your desk. I think there's some opportunities around growing digital markets for city enterprises. I'm thinking about the cultural organizations that actually went online. And finally, for some cities, opportunities to attract mobile knowledge workers. So it's a story, I think, of both challenges and opportunities. But I think if you want to, my final point really is that cities before the pandemic were facing two major sort of global challenges. One was climate change, and one was growing economic inequality. They now face the challenge of recovery, but I think what we should be thinking about today is how do we direct recovery to help us meet those challenges of climate change or the climate crisis and narrowing social inequality. Thank you, Jeff.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ben, for such a quick but also comprehensive introduction. You might maybe put in the chat telling people where that swimming pool is, which maybe was probably in some people's minds, seeing that rather idyllic scene on the screen. In a moment, we're going to hear from Debbie Weeks-Bernard, who's the Deputy Mayor of London for Communities, and who wrote a very useful piece in the run-up to this session. We are going to later on turn to lots of other cities, to Boston and Milan, Helsinki, Minneapolis, but we're starting with London. After Debbie's spoken, there'll be a few minutes for a first set of questions or comments, but do also please use the chat function for comments or questions or relevant links or facts which you think might be relevant to our conversation. Debbie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks, Ben, for that really, really interesting opener, I think, and discussion. Lots of food for thought there. And thanks, IPPO, for the invitation to speak today. It's a really interesting time to be having conversations about cities and recovery, and I think both Jeff and Ben have talked about the fact that we are, I suppose, in different stages of recovery, however you might define it, at different paces and at different rates across different parts of the globe. So in that respect, it is a really good time to be having a conversation about what recovery looks like, but also how we can learn from each other as cities as to how we responded to the pandemic, and how that response and what that response means for the way that we think about our recovery from it. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the interventions that we developed in London, but also to reflect, I guess one of the things that stood out from everything that you said, Ben, there was a lot of great stuff in there, was actually that quite worrying potential for increased working from home to have an impact on segregation. The remit that I have in London is around, promoting integration, it's around tackling inequalities, and workplaces, schools, all sorts of environments where you have the opportunity to bring people together from different backgrounds have been affected clearly by the pandemic. But while schools, I guess, and universities and other places might be enabling those opportunities to mix more freely, have, you know, that started to come back. Workplaces less so, and I think that's something that we really do need to keep an eye on as we start to think about our recovery going forward, certainly particularly in a city like London, which is so incredibly diverse. So I'm going to be I might have to come back to you, Ben, and have another chat with you about what that might mean for our recovery going forward. But there's two things I just wanted to reflect on in relation to our response and our thoughts on recovery in London. The first is specifically around the way in which our response to the pandemic and the way that we have started to talk about recovery has really opened up new possibilities for collaboration and partnership across London. And that partnership, that working together, and the forming of sometimes unusual partnerships has enabled us to do more, we think, in relation to recovery than we would have been able to do alone. And there are many things that we've learned from the pandemic, but I think partnership and collaboration is definitely one of the key things that we have learned in London, and one of the things that we're hoping we can continue to take forward as we continue down the road to recovery. And the second is around is sort of building on that point around segregation. It's around inequalities. And I know that later on in the programme, you'll be hearing from Kim Wright, who is the Chief Exec of the London Borough of Lewisham, who has been helping us to think about how we tackle some of those key issues, which have led to just the way in which particular communities, particular sectors were really disproportionately impacted by COVID, and that we have to use both what we've learned, but also recognize that a lot of what happened during the pandemic was clearly just a reflection of what was already happening before the pandemic hit, and that we use that to make sure that our recovery from COVID is an equal one, is a fair one, is a safe one, a green one, and a more prosperous one. If I go back to the point around partnership, what we've definitely realized and what we've recognized and what we've built on is the fact that the only way to face the challenges presented to us by COVID is to do so together. And back in the summer of 2020, we set up the London Recovery Board, and it was a grouping of all the key decision makers across London, from across local and regional government, from across our business sector, from our higher education sector, public health, but also our voluntary and community sector, our faith sector, those who fund that sector. And we came together recognizing that we were coming together at a time when we were still in response mode, also importantly. So if you consider the summer of 2020 in the UK was one in which we were going from one lockdown potentially to another, where rates were had gone down in the summer, but were slowly beginning to increase. And we were also trying to come up with plans for a recovery to London before the rollout of the vaccine had happened. So we had sat down as a board to talk about recovery at a point when we were still in response mode, when we weren't sure about what the vaccine would enable us to do, but in full recognition that the best way to think about recovery is to learn as we went along. And I know that there were a couple of suggestions that we were driving a car that we were building as we were driving, and it was something that I know our chief of staff at the GLA kept on saying frequently in different meetings, but it literally was that we were learning from what the data was telling us. We were learning from the way in which different sectors were being impacted by COVID, and we were using that to try to develop our response. And I think that's a really effective way of trying to think about recovery, because we were learning on the ground from the data, from the evidence, and what we have come up with has been completely informed by the way in which COVID was clearly impacting upon different groups, different communities, different sectors. The other point around inequalities, though, is really important, because one of the things that we decided that we really had to do was to place equality at the centre of the work that we were doing around recovery. So at the very beginning of 2020, some of you may remember Sir Michael Marmot's review, in which he was talking about health inequalities, and he recognised that unlike 10 years prior, when he had published his earlier review, when life expectancy rates were increasing, at the beginning of 2020, life expectancy had stalled. And he also recognised that life expectancy was actually decreasing in certain parts of the UK where 10% of the most deprived communities were living, and that it was decreasing for particular communities who were living in those 10% most deprived parts of the UK. And the reason that that's important is that we already knew that there were inequalities at work with regards to health. And so if we acknowledge that those inequalities existed before the pandemic itself began to bite, it then becomes no surprise when we look at who were the communities who were most likely to have those disproportionately high rates of infection and of death, which were the communities which were more likely to suffer as a result of the lockdown in relation to the sorts of sectors that they were working in, which were the communities who were experiencing those higher rates of mental ill health because of the way that being isolated and kept away from each other was having an impact on them. And so what it was incredibly clear to us was that we couldn't talk about a recovery which was a bounce back to where we were beforehand, because we already knew that beforehand was problematic for particular communities. And so we had to centre tackling inequality and promoting fairness in the way in which we developed that work. So that's why the partnership is and was at that point so important. It was important because we recognised that we could only do so much on our own. So there's only so much that the Mayor of London can do, given the sorts of powers that have been devolved to him as the Mayor of London. There is only so much that the NHS or public health directors can do. There's only so much that local authorities, so all of London's 33 boroughs are represented on the London Recovery Board via London councils, which is the political leaders of all of those boroughs. There is only so much that they could do, and working together would enable us to try to tackle the various different parts of the areas of responsibility that we all had, to try to really drive through some of those key issues. So we set ourselves a grand challenge. And the grand challenge was to restore confidence in the city, to minimise the impact on London's most vulnerable communities, and to build back better the city's economy and society. And we did that by developing a missions approach. So we developed some missions, and these were aims, objectives that we set ourselves, which were both ambitious but also time limited. And we developed 9 such missions. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about 3 of them for you today.
Very briefly, because we're just
very briefly. Okay, right. I might talk about just 2 of them.
Just
okay.
2.
New Deal for Young People mission is something that we developed because we could see the way in which the pandemic was having an impact on some of our youngest members of society. That's a mission that's provided around £5 million for mentoring programs and is supporting 30,000 young Londoners. And we've been able to do that already by building on the work that is being targeted at young people by different members of our recovery board, but also recognising that there's lots of really important work that's already happening. And then the second one I'll mention very briefly is mental health. I talked a little bit about social isolation. So we have a mission which is focusing quite specifically on the mental health of Londoners. And we have a mission which has already supported around 300,000 Londoners who've been experiencing loss through bereavement, developed by Thrive London and in a partnership with the NHS, the GLA, and with London councils. The other point, just to very briefly note, is that we've also developed a London Anchor Institutions Charter, recognising that some of our largest institutions in London are both the most trusted in their local communities, but also some of the biggest employers, and also have a huge power in the way that they secure contracts, in the way that they in levels of procurement, but also what they can do to tackle poverty by making sure they pay the London living wage, etc. So we've done a really important piece of work by bringing all of those anchor institutions together and recognizing the power that they have to work together to tackle some of those key issues. I suppose, just by way of closing, all of what we've done so far, and there's obviously lots more I could talk about, has been a real demonstration of that collaborative working and that partnership working. We know that there are different ways of working across government, across sectors in different cities, but we're hoping that this is something that we can do to try to shift the dial on some of those really enduring challenges for different communities in our city. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what some of the other cities have been doing under similar circumstances, but to tackle some of their enduring challenges and issues as we go forward. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone else throughout this event today. Thanks so much, and I'm sorry if I ran over time.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Debbie. And maybe you or one of your colleagues might put in the chat some links to some of the things like the summary of the 9 missions and so on for others. The mental health issue you raised was a topic about a month ago for one of this series, and we're doing quite a big program through IPPO on what's been learned on population level mental health strategies. How do you really affect 10, 20, 30% of the population, not just the most acute, which is clearly going to be a big topic for cities. The non-UK people on this call may be a little bit surprised to learn that, yes, life expectancy went up for about, 200 years, and then a few years ago started turning down, to everyone's horror, right across the UK, just as in fact incomes went up for 200 years and pretty much started stagnating a decade ago, as did productivity. So we've got a number of these stagnations happening as a backdrop to this discussion. Perhaps just before I hand over to Wendy Thompson, right at the beginning, Debbie, you mentioned unusual partnerships. Can I ask a really unfair question? What's the most unusual partnership? Just to very, very briefly mention. Is there one you might just?
Wow, that's really unfair. Okay. No. I think, okay. So, and this might seem controversial, but having a partnership board where you have the Metropolitan Police represented, and some of our grassroots voluntary sector organisations also represented, I think that probably presents one of those unusual pairings, definitely.
And that's what makes cities work. People have to learn to get on with each other, even if they're not necessarily used to doing so. Thank you very much, Debbie. We'll come back to many of these themes later. And Wendy, are you ready to take over?
Yes, thanks.
Traffic control from me.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Jeff. I think we've made a seamless transition without a crash, I believe. Thank you for the handover. I'm really delighted to be joining in this conversation. The universities have very much put their resources and abilities towards London's recovery, very much recognize the work that Debbie Weeks-Bernard has described around the missions and the importance of sort of trying to solve problems as we're in motion. So we're really pleased to be part of this this effort, terribly important for London. In this next session, we are going to be looking at 3 big topical issues: sustainability, young people, jobs and skills, and finally inequalities. These aren't new issues, as you know, but they are ones that took on a particular characteristic with the pandemic. Not all people experienced the pandemic in the same way. Not all, social issues were affected in the same way. So we're going to look at each of these in turn to see, what particular ways the pandemic brought problems to the fore, and perhaps in many cases also new opportunities that people wanted to make the most of where they could. So we've got a really star-studded group of contributors from different parts of the world. We're going to start off with sustainability, and again, very challenging timescales here with 7 minutes attributed to each speaker. And the first one is Reverend Mariama White Hammond, who's the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space from Boston, the USA. So over to you, Mariama, I hope.
Yes, I'm here.
Good.
Thank you.
Good to know.
It's good to be with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, it's all good.
Beautiful. So I want to go ahead and share some slides quickly, just so you have some context for the work that we are doing. Let's see. All right. So, it's great to be with so many of you today. I think many of us are in the same exact boat. We are in this moment where our communities have been rocked in ways that maybe we never considered imaginable. And yet we have an opportunity in this recovery moment to really think about how we lean into this moment in a way that creates new opportunities. I want to talk a little bit about how Boston is doing that, and I'm going to keep it really brief. And so we'll lean in on a few key examples, and hope that will offer us some opportunity to sort of lean into how we're approaching this. I want to say that we look at the budget, and can you all see my slides?
Not yet.
No, I think that there we go. Sorry. I think I tried to make them bigger and that was not a good idea. So I'll go back. All right, there we go. All right, can you see it now? No, okay, let's reshare.
This is a universal experience from the pandemic. We can all relate to that.
I know, we'll just leave it this way for now. So anyway, one of the things I think it's really important is that when you talk about values, we look at the budget as probably the clearest statement of a city's values, the things that it's putting first and foremost and what it's prioritizing. And so Mayor Wu came into office, ran during the pandemic, and came into office at a time where we were very much facing the reality of the pandemic and people were asking questions about how to recover. And so I want to just share a few things, a few places where we're making some investments that are particularly the investments from the dollars that we received from the federal government, ARPA funds, the American Rescue Plan Act, that really pumped millions and billions of dollars into cities and states, giving them the opportunity to prioritize how they wanted to face the recovery. There are tons of solutions that we've been trying to lean into, but I want to note that for the US, the other layer to how we experience the reality of the COVID epidemic is that we also had real reckoning with issues of racial justice, both because of who lost their jobs in the pandemic, who were disproportionately affected by the health impacts of the pandemic, but also with the death of George Floyd, really bringing into focus a challenge that this country has faced for a very, very, very long time. And the reality is there hasn't really been an uptick in police killings in this country. What has changed is that millions of people are walking around with video cameras, and now we have the opportunity to share those videos in ways that we never did 20 years ago. And that radical shift in technology has actually shifted the conversation. And so we also think that COVID is shifting the conversation in a variety of ways. I think, honestly, if everyone had been going about in the hustle and bustle of their lives, I'm not sure we would have had the same kind of national conversation about race and equity that we have had. So I'm going to talk about 4 investments, all of which are giving clear examples of our attempts to sit clearly at the intersection of equity and climate. We are saying that we don't have to make a choice between things that have social impact and things that have climate impact. What we're looking for is the sweet spot of things that actually have social and climate impact at the same way, as a way to make our dollars go a little bit further. So one of these initiatives is our work to electrify school buses. This is only a small portion of the money. The majority of the money is actually coming out of the school department's budget, but and some of the ESSER funds, which is another program that was for schools particularly. But we really looked at how we could use some of our ARPA recovery funds to pay for the electrification infrastructure that was not allowable around some of the other funds that we had. And so the goal is to electrify a Boston school fleet by 2030. We have already put in our order for buses. I know all of you are dealing with the realities of the delays in supply chain. So we are keeping our fingers crossed that they will arrive on time, and we're expecting to take possession of those buses in the early spring of next year and deploy them in the 2023-2024 year. So we have put together, a lot of this, like how do we upgrade our grid to be ready for this? How do we make sure that we have the right routes? We're actually particularly focusing on routes in our what we consider environmental justice neighborhoods, those neighborhoods that have seen the highest burden from environmental impacts, really asking ourselves, how could we be using the deployment of these school buses in a way that reduces our air pollution burden, particularly on our communities that bear it the most? And I think we're really excited to have our children riding on these buses to see climate action in a really tangible way that impacts them and their families. We're also doing a lot of work around tree canopy. This is actually a small portion. We also have money in our main budget focused in this area. And we're actually not just trying to plant more trees. We've taken a holistic approach to look at why are we losing trees? What kind of trees should we be planting? And not just how we think about public side investments, but also what are the possibilities on the private sector? Because we are losing quite a bit of our canopy, and we are losing much more of it in private land than we are in public land. And so we've been really looking at how we use funds to catalyze our trees, really thinking of our trees as infrastructure that supports our issues around water, infrastructure that supports our heat challenges. It is unfortunate, but if you look at the redlining map for Boston, that map where banks decided what communities they would invest in and which they would not, and then you put our heat map up against that, you will find that overwhelmingly our lowest income neighborhoods, our neighborhoods with the highest percentage of folks of color, are also our neighborhoods that have the greatest amount of heat and the lowest tree canopy. So we're not just figuring out what we can do overall, we're also taking a pretty focused approach to ask, what can we do to focus and support on our communities that have been left out from the tree canopy. Our third intervention is around a food systems approach. We are an urban community. There's no way we will ever grow all of our food. However, we know that if we could grow more and more of our food locally, it makes a difference in terms of all the shipping that happens to bring our foods. It reduces the amount of packaging that we have around our foods, and it creates opportunities for people to build connections and have a sense of ownership. I am a gardener. I also own a owner in a co-op farm, and I know that growing food is not just a health intervention for your body, but also a mental health intervention, and something we have a wait list of almost 1,000 people who want grow beds in our city. And so we've been using these resources will both help people in terms of coupons at farmers market, being able to access local food, but also to be able to grow their own local food. And finally, our intervention around green jobs. Again, and I do want to note, sorry, in the food systems, I want to note that one of the things we've spent a lot of time thinking about is who are the communities that do not have access to traditional food security programs. In our country, there's quite a few people who are undocumented. There were rules that got even more stringent over the last years about who could access those benefits. So our approach is pretty targeted, particularly in our immigrant communities, many of whom come to the US with experience in growing in gardens or farms from home and don't have access to land. So this is also a question about how we make sure the people who have been dispossessed from land have the opportunity to engage. And then finally, our program called PowerCorps. We want to give so much credit to PowerCorps Philadelphia, who started this program. We are replicating this program as also as Pittsburgh, but we're really asking ourselves, how do we make sure that our marginalized communities, what we often call opportunity youth, young people who may have moved through our school system but did not find their way on to university, are stuck in the kinds of jobs that do not have a career path. How can we put those folks at the front of the line in the green job sectors that we know are growing? So this interacts with our tree canopy, because some of the money that we're putting here teaches these young people and young adults to prune trees, We'll have them out with some of our park rangers, looking at how they can help control our geese population in the city. You might be surprised to know that Boston has a pretty large geese population, and they are very adamant. If you try to move them out of the way, they will make you very clear that they are permanent residents, even though they are Canadian geese who in theory should be making their way to our neighbor in the north. They have decided to stay, and unfortunately, because residents feed them, they feel no need to continue their migratory path. So we're engaging and teaching our young people and young adults how they can help us to manage all of the green impacts that we have across the city. I know that my time is up, so I will stop there and look forward to engaging in dialogue as we move forward.
Thanks, Mariama. Really some excellent examples of practical ways that you can get things done and advance the objectives, that you were talking about on sustainability. So thanks. We'll hopefully have some time for discussions if we have a few minutes at the end, but we better press on now. We have a contribution from Milan, Italy, from a Demetrio Scopoliti. I hope Demetrio is with us. I see her in the.
Yes, I am.
Sorry, him in. Sorry.
Hope you can see me. I don't see myself, but hope
yeah,
you
we
can do
see
it.
you. So looking forward to hearing from you, Demetrio.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate be part of this very interesting panel and hope to contribute to what's the scope. I would like to particularly to introduce what we did in Milan. Hope you can see my slides because it is something that we learned from the pandemic. Okay, you see also them moving, right?
Yeah, they're good.
Okay, that's perfect. So we learned something, and that's good. It's a good point. In Milan, before the pandemic, we were just approving a new city master plan. One of those plans where you set a vision for the future city, which aims at the next decade, which is, of course, the time needed to achieve change, but also a good comfort zone to do nothing in between, or to do not that much. And all the strategies, the visions that we had, of course, were putting public space in the center of our city, setting new paradigms, of course, sustainable mobility, ecology, urban quality, social inclusion. There is a city in the world that's not envisioning something like that. I think all of us are working in the same direction. The issue is that the crisis that we lived, and the crisis that we lived was a health crisis, but we're living another one, which is an environmental crisis, which is probably could have a stronger impact, even it's probably less immediate. Change completely our habits from one day to the other one, change our public space, it make it empty. And we, after the first period of understanding where we were, Milan was highly affected before other cities and before other world cities in Europe. We felt the urgency to write a new plan, an adaptation plan. It basically was trying to, in a rush, anticipating the same vision that we were planning for the next future, trying to understand if the pandemic could have been, and the crisis could have been, a moment of choice to improve our city concerning what the normality was in certain fields, in many fields, including, for instance, the mobility one. So what we did at that time was envisioning and trying to predict these scenarios, future scenarios, that how the pandemic could have been evolved. I think we got more or less to a good process of periods of containment, lockdowns, and then moments of what we call new normality, new ordinary. We set up a series of pillars that we wanted to achieve. Like, for instance, one very important, we have to go fast, so we have to reduce bureaucracy in order to achieve change. We envision a series of topics, and we plan a series of strategies and policies. I will talk particularly about the ones related to mobility and public space, which are my fields. which could respond to what I think is the real challenge that cities has nowadays, which is not defining a vision, but it's how we can achieve it quickly enough in order to respond to the crisis that the world is making us facing on. To change public space, useless to say, we have a business as usual methodology which takes millions, years, bureaucracy to get from a line to the implementation, and there's a issue that everything we do is not reversible. So in the last years and before the pandemic, actually, we launched the Tactical Urbanism Program to do something very easy, which is accelerating change, do pilot projects, and then pilot projects that could be realized in months and not years, with thousands and not millions of euros, that could be reversible, flexible, and also very easy to change. So places like this, plazas in our more peripheral neighborhood, they were plaza by name but not by fact, because they were actually car parks. Many we have, unfortunately, still in our cities, could have been transformed in weeks in order to achieve a different idea of urban life. And this was done before. And then actually you could implement a permanent change. This was something that we did before. We started before the pandemic, but was an incredible tool while the pandemic happened, because the streets were empty, the public space were empty. They were like blank pages where to draw the vision that we were planning. And we did it with a series of very easy tools. I'm not talking much about this, but elements, just furniture elements, and two other tools which we always use, which is collaboration pact, so an agreement with the community engagement, defined by a proper contract of whose responsibility for what in the public space design and maintenance, and then volunteering in order to engage the community in the realization and the reappropriation of the spaces. Before the pandemic, we launched this Open Plaza program. We did some pilot, asked before top down and then asked by the community. And when we were in the lockdown, we had to respond to the 65 proposals that we got. And we had, at the moment when the pandemic started, we were just like, okay, maybe our public space program is gonna die because we're not gonna work on public space now because we were forbidden to exit from our place for months. In reality, 2020 was a year where we accelerated the program and we transformed a series of spaces in front of schools, in front of public services, in order to make people living better and in a safer way, the social and physical distancing, the gathering and entrance and exiting procedures from the schools, from the services. And we continued, if we can say that the crisis is probably going towards this crisis, going towards an end, we continue doing this as a legacy of that moment. But most important, I mean, in parallel of that, we also use the fact that we saw our streets empty in order to change the way that mobility could work in our cities. How? Just pushing cars a couple of meters towards the center of the street in order to allow pedestrian and bike connection to be protected by cars, or with installation of very easy to install curb, or sometimes just tracing lines that could define the way and the path for cyclists to go through. A series of innovations that demonstrated by monitoring, particularly one on the major corridors, Corso Buenos Aires, that we have in our cities, one of our most important commercial streets, that if you create an infrastructure, no matter if it's an easy and quick one, realized in 2 months, designed during the day and implemented during the night, you can have during peak hours more bikes than cars in a sunny day. And that's something that was not conceivable before the pandemic. And we saw our data and our mobility patterns completely changing where we implemented the lanes, 67 kilometers of lanes. And then we also facilitated a new use of public space, reconsidering and negotiating the fact that car parks is not a right, and the public space that is used by car parks could be used by other interests, could be economic interests, could be trees, could be implementation of nature, could be a bench. And we implemented 1,000 street trees or parklets, if you want to call it like that, instead of car parks in the city, that allowed actually to our economic activity, particularly to the street front and then the ground floor, to keep living during that period of crisis. And we experiment the use of the street in a different way. And we learn actually that change is not a matter of how much you can spend, but is a matter of how your mindset is, and that the role of public administration should be facilitating change that could be as fast as possible to the request of the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Demetrio. Lots of very practical ideas. I like the idea of tactical urbanism, because it's true, it's quite often can take very many years for big projects to come to life. So it's great to see some practical examples. I'm afraid this is a really pressurized timetable. So we're gonna, I'm afraid, not have time for questions at this point in order to keep up with the schedule. But if both Demetrio and Mariama can stay with us, we can perhaps have a few minutes at the end for questions. Because we're going to move on now to the next topic, thanks Demetrio, to discuss young people, jobs and skills. And here we're moving to Helsinki in Finland with Nasima Razmyar, who's the Deputy Mayor for Education in Helsinki. So I hope she's with us. Yes, I see her. So over to you, Nasima. Your challenging 7 minutes. There we go.
Oh my God. Oh, too tight. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you don't use the first minutes on my time, because I'm sharing the screen. Just one moment. And can you?
Yeah, they're good.
Yeah, everything is fine. Great, lovely. So good afternoon, everyone, and really, really warm greetings from Helsinki. And first of all, I would really like to thank all the organizers. I mean, it's really inspiring to hear your presentations. And of course, as a decision maker, it's always inspiring to hear the other solutions that are adopted elsewhere, and to have a new perspectives for one's own work, especially now that we are facing very similar challenges. I've been asked to share a few remarks on the work that we do in Helsinki in relation to our youth, their skills and jobs. First, I wish briefly sum up our COVID recovery plans, and then briefly give you overall picture of how our youth is doing at the moment. And then, of course, as a Deputy Mayor of Education, I would like to share some glimpse of our new focus areas. Helsinki is a city of 650,000 residents. We have set aside 70 million euros for recovery from pandemic, especially for the reconstruction needs for the years of 2022 and 23. The most emphasis is naturally placed on social and health services, but of course we have also other key targets, especially supporting youth employment. We have also additional 5.5 million euros to raise the salaries of the least earning workers. Here you just have some picture of our city, and we go forward. The pandemic has had strong impact on Helsinki's economics. The restrictions caused by the pandemic have hit service sectors, which is of course very critical to our economic structure, such as hospitality industry, tourism, arts, culture, and of course transportation and logistics. In several sectors, recovery has already begun with the improvement in the general economic situation, which is of course a very good thing. Restrictions related to the pandemic from the second quarter of 2020 dramatically increased the number of unemployment. The redundancy and the rise of unemployment were particularly strong with the young people. In addition, it was difficult for reason graduates to find even a work. At the beginning of the COVID crisis, the number of young unemployment actually doubled from the year ago. So this was very dramatic for us. Our youth. Our future lies on the hands of our kids and, of course, young people. People aged 26 to 30 are the biggest group of residents in Helsinki. So we are a very young city, as you can see. The majority of our youth does better than ever before. But the ones that are doing poorly are doing even more so. And this is, of course, very concerning to us. We wish to ensure the needs of our young people are met in all areas of life. Therefore, we have categorized our services into 4 main paths, from which young people can find the services they need during different stages of their lives. Health and well-being. An increasing need for especially mental health services is recognized in Helsinki. We have started new practices to offer new easy access services, for example, by offering help in our low threshold mental health service unit, Mieppi, which offers discussion support for young people over age 13. Studies and work. There are nearly 100,000 university students in Helsinki. We wish to support them by addressing student houses and, of course, different type of student benefits. We also cherish the active democratic participation of our students by the World Student Capital Network, which is a very important partner in building our services to fit these needs of our students. Culture and youth work, of course, is very important. And our youth council is participating very regularly in the city council's meeting, and we are having very active role with them as well. We also wish to promote participatory budgeting. Last time, Helsinki allocated 8.8 million euros to very different kind of projects that were voted by the citizens. And it's important to say that you can vote over from the age of 12. So you can be very young and still vote in our participatory budgeting. We are taking several measures to promote youth employment. I will just give you very briefly some examples. I know I don't have really much of time, but I will give this very briefly. Face-to-face meetings are really important for us. As we all know, virtual meetings are important, but we need people. We need people for our young people. In addition, many young people, as you know, need very different kind of services and support. These needs to be very highlighted during, especially during after pandemic. So we have targeted services provided by young people, such as various coaching, job requirement events by our Ohjaamo Helsinki's Guidance Center, which is a place where you have actually all the support in one place. And I think this is really important for the young people, that you don't put you to different places and different services. You can get all the services in one place. We have also different kind of summertime activities at the moment. Summer events and information on services are available for those who are graduated at the moment. We are doing this very closely with our universities, with our schools, and also our Ohjaamo Helsinki's Guidance Center's services in Helsinki is placed to every young people under 30-year-old, so everyone can get services from there. We are also having different campaigns. I won't tell you more about that, but we have had very active campaigns regarding to young people, how to reach them also in a very different new ways. Support for young people from Ukraine, we also have that. I can tell you more, maybe if we have more time after my presentation, but it's of course very important for us how to have a key role also with the young people from Ukraine at the moment. And here you just have education is, of course, very important for us. Education is among the most important factors in supporting youth in gaining relevant skills for working life. We have an ongoing project of creating a new strategy for education services to take us to the very next decade. The strategy work brings together several stakeholders from public, private, and third sector to ensure all the views are taken into account. Creativity, resilience, cooperation skills, conflict management, critical thinking, self-management are all very important skills of the future. We emphasize the emotions and values are a key part of learning. We want to ensure lifelong possibilities for every resident, and the way to do that is to strengthen the lifelong learning. I'm pretty much there. So yes, everyone should be included. I think this is incredibly important for us, and our strategy name is called Place of Growth. And this means for us, of course, that everyone should be included, and we should guide especially our young people all around the city. Just to quickly sum up, Helsinki strategy was written during the pandemic. So obviously it has affected in our strategy. It adopts recovery measures to all our divisions. And I think this is, of course, very important to our whole strategy. A strong emphasis is placed on education, its strategic development and new skills agenda that we need more than ever before. Our youth is supported by several measures in relation to employment. I think we are doing quite okay, but of course the situation is quite hard for us as well, pandemic and now the war in Europe. But this is very quick overall of the work that we are doing in Helsinki. I would really like to thank your attention, and I hope we have some time for the questions.
Thank you so much, Naseema. That was really, really helpful. Really, you can see the common themes emerging, even in very different contexts. How mental health issues amongst young people, the importance of partnership, not being able to do it all on your own. These are, some common themes. I'm afraid I'm bound by the program, so I'm afraid we're not going to be able to have any questions right now. If we're lucky, we might be able to bag a few moments at the end of these three issues. But thanks so much, Naseema. Really, really interesting to see. And I know people would like to hear more about the Ukrainian situation for young people. But for now, I thank you, and we press on to the next and third issue is about inequalities. Been inequalities mentioned really in all of the two previous sessions, but this is focused specifically on inequalities. And our first speaker is Jacob Frey, who's from Minneapolis. He's the mayor of Minneapolis. Never can say Minneapolis. I've got it, Minneapolis. Thanks so much, and apologies for not. It's always been a challenge, even for a Canadian. So thanks very much, Mayor. If I'll ask you to start off now. Thank you. Jacob Frey.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Thompson. You got it right. Ultimately, it is Minneapolis. Oftentimes people will say Minneapolis. That is the wrong way of saying it. It's just one Minneapolis, and that's it. And thank you so much to the International Public Policy Observatory for inviting me to participate in this panel today. And I appreciate that there's a focus on some of these inequalities that have been created through COVID-19, and then talking about some of these recovery efforts that we're working on. And one of the things that I've said often is it's not as if these inequities didn't exist prior to the onset of this global pandemic, but the fault lines of disparities have been further exposed. So they already existed, they were already there. They just became more visible for people to see, especially when you get confronted by this sequencing of crises one after another. And it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. In Minneapolis, we have had our fair share of crises over these last couple of years. In many cases, our city has been operating in some declaration of emergency for quite some time. And at the same time, right now, things are coming back. in a beautiful way. But what has been really clear over these last couple of years is that we want to find ways so that we're not just refusing to exacerbate some of these inequalities, but we've also made sure to find ways to transform in full. So as of November of 2021, I created and set up an inclusive economic recovery group, and that builds on the work from a Rebuild Minneapolis group that we set up previously. And the whole concept is to accelerate some of the strategies that we have in place. And again, the goal is to get back, not just get back to the old normal, but to blow by that old normal and to see something truly transformational. And one of the big areas where we want to focus on is ownership. Ownership has been a vehicle for generation after generation to build intergenerational wealth. It has been a vehicle to generate equity for the long term. And we know that that vehicle has only been provided and is only accessible, has been to predominantly white people in our city for a long time. We have a long history in Minneapolis, and I know this is the history nationwide, of restrictive covenants that run with the land. We have maps that were set up that quite literally designate Minneapolis, North Minneapolis, as a slum for Blacks and Jews. And that goes back 80 or 90 years. We've had intentional segregation efforts. And so we want to make sure now that we have the precision of our solutions match the precision of the harm that was initially inflicted there. And so we've instituted a number of policies, first going back several years, to push to allow for a diversity of housing options and then a diversity of people in every neighborhood. We got rid of single family exclusive zoning in our city, so that in addition to being able to put up a really high-end large mansion, you can also put up something more affordable in the form of a duplex or a triplex throughout our neighborhoods. It was really controversial, but it was a necessary step to take. We've also created this big focus on ownership, ownership of homes. We've devoted quite a bit of money to our Minneapolis, our homes plan. It's spelled HOM, and that plan is around making sure that people have the ability to buy their own home. And what we found was oftentimes people would have the ability to pay the principal on a mortgage every month, but they didn't necessarily have the down payment. This program steps up to help provide down payment assistance, to help bridge that gap between the market rate and whatever the more affordable rate would be. And it allows people to help to generate that long-term intergenerational wealth that we know that is so important. We've also focused substantially on commercial property ownership as well. What we noticed is that some of the places that were hardest hit by the global pandemic were the same areas that were hardest hit during the unrest following the murder of George Floyd. And we want these areas to come back. We want these areas to make sure that the people, the communities that made these corridors wonderful to begin with, don't get the boot when the values go up again, and they are going up again, and the rents get jacked through the roof, and suddenly people get displaced from these corridors that they made wonderful to begin with. We want them, these communities, to be able to reap the benefits of these gains in value. And the only way that you do that is through ownership. And so we're investing in this commercial property development fund to ensure that these business owners can own not just the underlying business, but also the underlying real estate. And this fund will provide gap funding so that they're able to do exactly that. And so since this program has been making loans since the fall of 2020, we've approved about 15 loans totaling $7.4 million. Total project costs for these 15 projects is around $37 million. And by the way, 80% of the borrowers are BIPOC. Just around 50% are women as well. So we want to be specifically targeting and working with communities that we're hoping to serve here. And so this pandemic prevention measures, it really had a major impact on all small businesses. due to mandatory closures, capacity restrictions that we've seen, and a whole host of other health measures. And so in response, what we've done is we've invested another $10 million in this fund that I just mentioned to make sure that, again, people can own the underlying real estate. And so, but we aren't stopping there. We know that we're going to need to provide the assistance as these businesses and small businesses get back up and running again. And we're going to need to provide the assistance also to those that are struggling most first. One of the big things that we focused on recently to help those that are struggling in some form is our guaranteed basic income pilot. And so we're working with the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis to provide a rigorous evaluation of this program, which we hope will add to the body of national research on the impacts of guaranteed basic income and what that will mean. And the whole notion of this program is that people are better able to dictate how best to spend their funds. They're best to dictate where their family needs to spend money, and we want to be able to provide that choice for them as much as possible. And so we hope to show that this investment is successful and maybe even could be executed on the state and federal sides as well. And it would give some real significant financial stability to these low-income residents to allow them to live their lives, to pursue an education, to get job training, to pay for reliable childcare, or simply just to get some additional flexibility. And so these are the programs, just a few examples of them anyway, that we're working on. And it's really good to hear the work that is also taking place in other areas of the world where I think we're all responding to fairly similar situations here as we hopefully move out of this long pandemic. But I think collectively we're on the right path. And I think these experiences will teach us quite a bit going into the future. And so I look forward to hearing now from some of my other fellow panelists from Canada and from London about their approaches to these same issues. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be with all of you.
Thank you so much, Mayor. It's great for you to join us, and it's good to hear the story from Minneapolis, which I got right this time first.
Nailed it.
Yeah, nailed it finally. Anyway, thank you so much. And, housing always a critical issue in people's mobility. So thanks for sharing some of those ideas. We're going to press on now to Marie-Christine Terrien, who is the director of Cité Idy Living Lab Urban Resilience Governance Canada. I think Marie-Christine is in Montreal.
Actually, I am. No, I am in Barcelona.
Oh, well, that's a good choice. All right, over
good
to
choice,
you.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Over to you, Marie-Christine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation from IPO. So yes, contrary to the previous speakers, I am not from a city, but in a university, but working very closely with cities as we are a living lab working on very pragmatic issues with cities. And we actually do work even with London, with the London Resilience Group. So that's very interesting. But what I have to say today is actually linked to elements that we've been doing since COVID with Montreal. And I want to share with you two ideas, basically, where, and you can see my PowerPoint, yes?
Yes. Yes.
Very good. So basically two ideas that are related to policies and mobilization for urban recovery. The first one is looking specifically into building more social infrastructure. We're dealing a lot with physical infrastructure, which is great. There's a lot of changes that need to be done around there. But social infrastructure really needs to be considered. So I'll talk about that linked to community engagement and more specifically on social capital. And the other thing that we've been working on with the city of Montreal, but other cities in the surrounding area of Montreal, is looking more into multi-level resilience and collaborative governance that are linked to developing actually resilience and recovery post-COVID, but also post any kind of crisis that occurs. So let's look first at social connections, social capital. What we've seen is that during COVID in Montreal, but in other areas of the world, social ties were really broken up. But if we want to increase the capacity of recovery of cities, what we really need to work on very specifically is to increase our social connection, because it has been demonstrated, as I will show further along, that our individual and collective resilience is actually increased by the social ties. So these social connections or social capital plays a really major role in having access to essential resources that we need. So whether they're financial or non-financial, they actually limit the number of deaths following a crisis. They allow for reconstruction, and they also mitigate a lot of the elements of psychological damage during or after a crisis such as COVID. So if we look at social capital, what does it mean? It means the set of resources that are offered to individuals through their social relationships. So this is Daniel Aldrich, a colleague of mine who works at Northeastern University in Boston, and we've been working with him also on this issue of social capital. And there's a lot of evidence that has been done in the past years on how the role of social capital increases resilience, especially following the heat wave in Chicago or Hurricane Katrina or the triple disaster in Japan and some of the recent wildfires in California. So what is social capital? So there's a lot of definitions out there, a lot of usage, but this is what we use, such as defined by Daniel Aldrich. There's actually three types of links that are really important. The bonding links, which are the close ties of your family, anything that's emotional or geographical, your aunt that lives nearby, within a network. And these are strong links because they are high in frequency, but also in intensity. But they're also very homogeneous. The bridging links are linked to the horizontal or weaker links in terms of frequency and intensity, and they're more heterogeneous. So it'll be your links, for example, with your church or with your social presence that you have with your community. And then the linking, which are the vertical links that you have with the institutions or the entities, which give you access to power, which give you access to authority and being able to have some kind of discussion or an influence where you can make a difference. So these elements are actually measured, and we've measured them during COVID in Montreal with the help of public health authorities and the city of Montreal. So for the sake of numbers, I will not give you the results of numbers. They're uninteresting if you're not from the city, but give you more sort of the elements that are related to the recommendations that are linked to these numbers. What we've noticed, and this has been said by previous speakers that we've had, is that there's an isolation cycle. So there's a very vicious circle. If you were isolated, COVID has isolated you more because very often the bonding links, so the very close ties, are actually closing you off to the bridging and linking ties. And this population really in the reconstruction of a social infrastructure should be targeted as a priority. So in the measures that we did in Montreal, we did 6 boroughs where this was measured, and the isolation cycle is throughout the boroughs of a very vulnerable population that is very isolated. In terms of social cohesion, we found that in some of the boroughs where we did the measurement is that there was a distrust of young people and of strangers. And this is potentially a problem, and there's a strategy that needs to be developed. So the city has taken this into consideration in their recovery planning. And finally, the strengthening overall of social ties needs to be done as a strategy from the city and from public health authorities. So because of the study we did in the recovery planning, there is now the inclusion of this construction of a social infrastructure, including social capital, where we're now working with them for 3 years, where we've been received funding from the provincial government in Quebec to help put this in place with the City of Montreal and public health authorities in that area. So the second subject I wanted to talk to you about very quickly is this importance of building multi-level resilience and collaborative governance. So we've seen that there's, throughout cities, an accentuated imbalance, and that the needs, new needs, and exacerbated vulnerabilities are more present. And we have to look at the fact that COVID is not over, and it will take some time before it is over, and that we are starting the recovery process, even though it's not over. So recovery is less glamorous than intervention, especially for public authorities. And we've seen that a lot of them are fatigued, even exhausted, and there is a bit of a loss of interest often. So we need to keep that up. Events like today are very important to keep the support on recovery. So I think that resilience offers a very engaging approach, a very positive approach to build on the strength of the institutions that are out there and the distributed capacities. And I think it was Deputy Mayor Debbie Weeks-Bernard who was mentioning this, that the importance of building collaboration becomes more important. There's a lot of elements that are related to post-crisis resilient factors. They're sustainably recovering. A lot of this has been mentioned in all of the elements that are related to Build Back Better, where we want to learn and transform our cities and do better. But in terms of process and collaboration in terms of governance, there's a lot of learning to be done with the organizations, with the employees, with the citizens as opportunities for concerted actions on the territory or in the sectors, and also looking at strengthening systems. So the actors in cities are asking for more coherence, and we need to find levers around this. So these levers help us to review the coordination mechanisms, to use the strength of the silos in public administration, but also develop a capacity for integration and collaborative coordination. So develop this governance within and across organizations. And I think also pay particular attention to the implementation of these new public policies that are going to be developing. So very quickly, coordination mechanisms. We live in a network world. There's an interdependence of responsibility. So we need to dedicate time and resources for coordination. And I think the examples set out by Debbie Weeks-Bernard were very illustrating to this. Second, there is a science behind mechanisms for collaborative governance, where organizations have collaborated, but need to be using a lot more systematic process tools that are built around collaborative governance. So it's going beyond government, but it is more towards a network governance of intensive integration. And finally, we need to look at the implementation of new policies that are going to be developed post-COVID and in recovery also. Government pay a lot of attention to developing their policies, but maybe not enough attention to the implementation challenges that they carry. So we put recommendations out there, such as identifying strategic capabilities to be acquired in key positions. And some organizations are better than others at implementing policies. And also to recognize that there's variability from region to region, especially inside one country and between cities. So a few last words to conclude. The ideas of challenges of what I've called the post-crisis state. We're facing obviously major complex issues such as climate change, digital shift, healthcare, social inequalities, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I think that the recognition of the importance of developing a social infrastructure and not only physical infrastructure remains extremely high. We need also to continue increasing the balance between science, public policy, and policy. And also somewhat developing foresight capacity for institutions and the role of science in decision-making. So when we use the capacity to calculate social capital, is we're actually using science for decision-making. So thank you very much, and happy to take questions or comments.
Okay, thank you, Marie-Christine. We're interesting application of the social capital theory, and I'm interested to see it in practice in this context. I've got no time for questions, I'm afraid. In fact, we've bitten into the next one, but we've got one more to finish up on inequalities, and hopefully we can have time to take questions on that people can put in the chat at the end from all these issues. But the final word on inequalities goes to Kim Wright, who is the Chief Executive of Lewisham Council in London. So over to you, Kim.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I'm conscious I'm the last person to speak before we go to Q&A, so I will try and stick to my timing. I've got no slides, but what I'm here to talk today about is the work that the Structural Inequalities subgroup of the London Recovery Board have done in relation to developing an action plan to tackle the structural inequalities in London that were exacerbated by the pandemic. We knew they were already there. Why and how we did it, and how we hope it will have a multiplier effect across the city. Briefly, London is a city of over 9 billion people, 270 nationalities, living side by side, over 300 languages are spoken in our schools. Our demography continues to change, and when we get the latest census results, we expect our population to be even more wonderfully diverse than it is currently. And yet we know that not everyone experiences London equally. There are long-standing structural inequalities, as was said about Minneapolis, ingrained within society that impact on too many Londoners, disproportionately impacting on some communities more than others in the city. And COVID did further exacerbate that inequality and has had a greater impact on some communities than others. The evidence we used to underpin the action plan that we developed is clear that this disproportionate impact was driven by some of the underlying socio-economic inequality that pervades in London. Basically, those who were hit the hardest by the pandemic were Londoners already facing hardship and unequal living standards. Those who could least afford to lose were those who lost the most, and entrenched inequalities worsened during the COVID pandemic. And Londoners who were from Black, Asian and minoritized ethnic communities, those who were deaf and disabled, those who were LGBTQ+, older Londoners and women all faced inequalities already, but those were all worsened during the pandemic. So none of those issues are new, of course, and for those communities, it wasn't only a story of 2 years of disproportionate struggle, it was an intergenerational history of inequality. But the spotlight shone on those inequalities by the pandemic strengthened our resolve to address those pernicious systemic inequalities, to make lives better for those who now face even greater challenges. And the focus that we had in strengthening that resolve through the London Recovery Board was to develop an action plan specifically to tackle those inequalities that we saw disproportionately impact certain communities of Londoners. I was privileged enough to chair the subgroup that led this work, working very closely with Deputy Mayor Weeks Bernard in this work, and the action plan is central to London's wider recovery programme and central actually to the board's overall commitment to deliver a fairer, more equal city as we come out the other side of the pandemic. So the plan focuses on areas where actions can be taken directly by London's partners on the board, using the levers we've already got at our fingertips, not duplicating work that's already being done, but ensuring we're making best use of the available resources we've got at our fingertips. It also recognises that there's lots of good work being done, often in very challenging circumstances. So we're not starting from a standing still position, but we do want to get more traction, more pace, more grip on this crucial area of work. So the action plan, which is called Building a Fairer City, was launched just 2 weeks ago, so it's hot off the press, and I will make sure everybody gets a copy on this, gets emailed a copy who's on this session today. And it was on the 2nd anniversary of George Floyd's murder. We deliberately chose that date to launch the plan. It identifies 14 ambitious actions across 4 priorities that those Londoners most affected by the pandemic have told us should have the most significant impact across a range of inequalities and therefore have that multiplier effect. And those 4 priority areas are financial hardship and living standards, labour market inequality, equity in public services, and civil society strengthened support. And our approach is not to use this plan to tell organisations what to do. That's not in the Recovery Board's gift to do that anyway. But it is about providing a framework that gives the basis for prioritised action for partners across London, whether that's health, business, local government, civil society, police, and others. And it's about using that plan to identify things that they're already doing, which they can do more of, and things that they're not doing that they might want to choose to do because they know this matters most to those Londoners that have been most affected. So this is the start of the next chapter. Just publishing the plan, of course, isn't of itself going to make that impact, but it is about saying, let's double down our efforts in this area that we know the pandemic has had the biggest impact on. Over the course of the next year, bear in mind, as I say, we've only just launched the plan. We are going to be bringing partners together at both a strategic and operational level to support each other in delivering against the actions that are in the plan, to share experiences and insight, what's working, what isn't working, to share best practice so it becomes normal practice, and to provide expert input and challenge. We're also going to be setting up, crucially, communities of practice that are going to hold the ring in all of this and develop the metrics with the voice of Londoners at the heart of those communities of practice, so that we continue listening and hearing those voices, just as we did as we developed the action plan itself. And what's been really important about this plan is the collaboration and co-design with those communities most affected. We've been hearing their voices, we've been working with them so they can identify the changes they need, the actions they say will make the most difference, directly from their experience, listening to what their priorities are. And it's their voices that we've listened to most and their lived experience that has shaped the priorities and the actions. Because without this, we wouldn't and we won't understand the issues affecting London and how they impact on the lives of London's communities most affected. And it's their voices and experiences that form the foundations of the action plan. That approach will continue with the move to implementation. We're going to continue working with, hearing from, listening to communities, and the action plan is about London's recovery, its growth, its development, and its ongoing resilience. And I've been really heartened by the ambition and commitment that I've seen during the last year we put this work together, and by the over 130 organisations that have already signed up to this action plan as we build a fairer, better London for everyone. Thank you, Wendy. I'll end it there.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks so much. Some excellent contributions there from our speakers, and we'll feed in now to the wider plenary. Some common themes, as you can see, really from the very first speech from the Deputy Mayor of London, right, and Ben Rogers' presentation right through, I think, common, you know, the importance of collaboration and relationships, partnerships. You can't do it alone. The idea that people who were previously doing poorly are doing even more poorly after the pandemic. You know, really important to use the opportunities of the disruption caused by the pandemic, you know, to make something better happen coming through to recovery. So thank you, as I say, to all the speakers. And I'm going to hand over, I think, to Dr. Carla Washbourne, who's a professor in environmental science and policy at the University College London. Oh, I hope I've got that right. I see Carla, so I'm living in hope. Over to you, Carla.
You did. Thank you very much for the handover. And yes, thank you to everybody up to this point. And I have the pleasure of chairing the Q&A session, which I know is going to be very active, having had all of the thought-provoking talks that we've already had. I'm just going to flag at the beginning of this session that I know a few of our panelists have had to sort of stealthily switch in and out due to other time commitments over this time. But in this final session, we do still have with us Demetrio, Nazima, Marie-Christine, Kim, and we're also joined, I believe, and I think I've seen you in the list, by Luke Bruce, who is the director of the London Recovery Programme. So we do still have good representation across a number of the different cities that you can target your questions towards. Please do continue to drop questions in the chat. I'll ask the ones that have popped up, because I know that there are a few that have been sitting in the chat for a little while now, to make sure that we have those addressed, but please keep them coming. So not actually target to any one particular panelist. I think whoever feels that they have a particularly interesting take on this, but the first question that we had was actually around, and I guess I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, that developments which are already in train or had been begun pre-COVID. So the example given here is particularly things like skyscrapers, very big developments that perhaps seem slightly different in light of the pandemic and the issues that have been set out around the maybe different relationship that we have with cities now. Any observations, thoughts, or experiences on that from our cities in terms of what's been done or what could be done going forwards with these sorts of developments, if there've had to be reconsiderations, and if so, what those would look like?
I guess just an observation from me, Carla, if I may, is I think a really compelling feature of the action plan that we've been developed is the way that we've engaged and co-designed the priorities based on the vision statements that I know have been put in the chat by the communities most affected. And I'd like to think that as a way of working will gain greater profile and credence, given the powerfulness of what we've then heard and what we're able to act on going forward. So it's more of an observation rather than a direct response to the question.
Not at all, and it's helpful, thank you, to have those observations. And I realize it is quite a specific question, so I recognize, you know, if our speakers don't have particular responses on that, please don't worry, or if you do, or if you think of them, feel free to sort of jump in or drop things into the chat as well, or in fact, anybody else in the room, because I know that we have a lot of participants with us and others actually may have direct experience in this topic as well, so do feel free to jump in on the chat with those as well. We have a very specific question for you, Demetrio, if that's okay to ask, around the multicolored street marking or painting that you showed in your presentation. If you can explain just a little bit further about that.
Sorry, can you please repeat it, because I didn't understand 100%, sorry.
Yes, sure. So I will read it directly from the chat. Okay. So hopefully this makes sense. But it says, what is the idea behind the multicolored street marking or painting?
Oh. Basically, the fact that color is a tool to highlight the space that you reclaim from the street. Street is public space. Street is the most important amount of public space the city has. So it's an incredible asset. And what we see in our cities that actually they use that is done is generally speaking redundant in favor of the vehicles from the policies and planning that we had in the past century instead of the use for people. The color is like a pavement. It's a quick definition of the pavement that define the pedestrian area, and it's also a good tool to attract people and particularly children to use public space as a playground, which is another topic maybe we didn't touch much, but which is absolutely relevant. And I think during the pandemic, we saw the use of the street completely changing in our cities. We used to walk, I used to walk, and so many people used to walk in the middle of the street, in streets that were empty. So I think what we try to do is define the change and show that that space can change and show that there is a lot of redundancy in the street design that could be reclaimed.
Excellent, many thanks. I'm actually going to bring in, so just to flip the order slightly of the questions that are in the chat, we have a question around London particularly, so London's mayor and the boroughs and the powers that they have to enact various kinds of change in the city. And Luke, Bruce, I know we have not heard from you yet, so it would be wonderful if you can come in on that question.
Well, thank you very much, Carla, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel. As you know, Debbie's had to go, so she asked if I would mind sitting in. I think that the question that Charles raises there about powers are, clearly hugely important to the mayor and to the boroughs, and obviously, the mayor and indeed, I'm sure the boroughs would make the argument that we need greater devolution to London, and there's a whole debate in the UK about the devolution of powers to city regions and to cities going on. But I do think that probably that the answer is slightly more sophisticated than that, in as much as one of the things, and Debbie talked to this quite a lot in her presentation, is one of the things that the recovery process and the board and the program that we put in place has kind of taught us and driven us towards is the partnership working. So it's what can you do with the powers and resources you have, which even in a limited sense in London are still decent, reasonably significant. What can you do with them in a way which brings people together? And London can't just sit there and ask and wait for more powers. They may come, they may not. It has to use what it has and speak with one voice in a much more effective way. And the pandemic has taught us that. The pandemic has taught us the importance and power of that in a way which perhaps, I'd be interested in Ben's view on this perhaps, but London had perhaps got a bit blasé about, over time it had been a very successful city, but that kind of stuff that Ben talked about the threat to it became very real. And it'd be interesting for me and for the rest of us the extent to which that partnership, overcoming the weaknesses of some of the powers, becomes part of our city's institutions. And the recovery board clearly has a job to do about getting the city back on its feet, but does that become a permanent part of the city's governance and its infrastructure and dealing with kind of bringing people together in a way which perhaps hadn't happened before? My instinct is that probably it will, and I think that the pandemic has taught people a lot about the power of collaboration, the power of using what limited resources it does have effectively. And I think that will be the challenge for us over the next 6 months to kind of make that transition to something a lot more permanent.
Thank you very much. I apologize, Ben, we're not missing your question, but I think there's one which sort of follows maybe more naturally from the response just now, which I see in the chat, which is around the greatest challenges that our panelists see moving to the implementation of some of the plans that we've been discussing. So particularly whether post-pandemic recovery can be used as a tool to reinforce multi-level governance, or if it might be a missed opportunity to do so. So can we ensure that policy learning between cities is, well, have we learned basically? Have we learned, will we learn? Yeah, so any responses, in fact, from any of our cities on that would be excellent. Yeah.
So maybe I can have a quick go, Carla, from observation from not only Montreal, but other cities that we've been working with around the world. I think that, yes, there is, if we want to be positive about this, I think there is an opportunity to reinforce multi-level governance, very much so. There is somewhat often a tendency to go back to silos because it's been observed post-crises that organizations do want to go back to what they were doing before. It's so much more reassuring to do so. But the time or the length of the pandemic has actually given us the thrust to go more into multi-level governance. So I think that maybe not all, but a lot of it will remain. And in terms of city to city learning, what we've also observed is that putting together city networks that work on a specific issue and that are exchanging ideas and ways of doing and other elements such as that are the most efficient ones, where they decide that they want to be together, that they want to exchange, and that they have this capacity to work also with other groups inside their own network, such as academics and not-for-profit, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it is possible to do so, especially when it comes from the cities themselves.
If I can just make another comment on that to add to what Marie-Christine has said, and I was struck by one of your slides talking about collaborative governance. I think the other sort of experience we've had is not just the strength of talking with one voice as a city, but the development of trusted relationships with colleagues that we perhaps wouldn't have got to know so deeply and so quickly other than the crisis that we're all thrown into. So being able to use those trusted relationships to have perhaps some tricky, difficult conversations more quickly than we otherwise would have been able to enable us sometimes to take that leap of faith together, because we have got that trusted relationship, I think is another byproduct of the last couple of years of the pandemic, which I would hope would endure and continue focusing on the value of trusted relationships with colleagues across the city system.
Can I also add just a very few points? I think for us in Helsinki, it's incredibly important to give the right resources to our divisions, like I was mentioning, our recovery plan, because if we are looking at, for example, our schools, our teachers, they are incredibly tired at the moment. They have done a lot of work, 2 years with pandemic. So I think for us, it's really important to also add resources. And for example, at the moment, we are bringing or adding additional staff to our schools, just simply for counseling and giving the student support that children are needing at this point and at this time. So I think it's the implementation, all in all, is pretty much also about the resources. And I think it's a lot about the budgeting that cities should now realize that where are we going to put our focus. And for us, it's of course really important to have the focus on the children, on the youth, and especially on the areas where is the more damage than, for example, in the other areas of the city. So the positive discrimination money and resources are incredibly important at this stage of the pandemic.
Thank you so much, everybody. I apologize for being a terrible chair today because I'm losing my voice, which is the thing you don't want to have when you're chairing. But I know we don't have much longer, so hopefully I will hang in for 10 more minutes. I'm going to follow up just quickly on that question, actually. And I think I may look to you first, Marie-Christine, just because of the framing of your presentation in particular. But there is a question embedded within this session, which I think has sort of come up in some of these questions, which is really around how do the recovery plans that each of you have described relate to resilience for other crises forthcoming. And I shan't do the exhaustive list of I know we've mentioned many of the other issues that we're facing, either globally or locally. But it would be useful to hear your thoughts on that. So as I say, particularly, I know because you focused, Mary-Christine, on the resilience side, but from other cities as well, sort of how you feel that this experience and that the plans in particular that you've described speak into that resilience space as well as that kind of shorter term response to crisis.
Well, I think there's a lot of definitions around resilience and bouncing back and bouncing forward and all that. But for me, the definition of resilience, especially in the encompassing ways, is how we can actually consider transformation and towards the concept of build back better, which is very large in itself. But I think it's let's not do what we were doing before. And that is in all areas. It can be very from the physical side of what was shown, for example, in Milan, but also in new policies, which were in other cities such as Minneapolis or in Helsinki, for example. So I think that the links between recovery and resilience are actually very close. It's like a circle where you're recovering. What you're trying to do is build in more resilience by transformation, and that can be on all levels. And one of them is actually on the governance level. I think very important to consider and change our ways of doing things. And if I may, very shortly, to answer the second to last question, or no, not answer, but give some kind of way. It's true that the cities in most parts of the world have their income between 80 to 85% from a tax base. So this discussion with other levels of government on the multi-level governance will need to actually be more developed now, because there's so much pressure on cities, and that they need to put in, and they want to put in a lot of programs. I think there's a new discussion that has to be built between the higher level government and the cities.
Thank you very much. Any thoughts from any other panelists on this question?
I mean, if I might, Carla, just I mean, you look at the missions and the work that we've taken forward as part of the London Recovery Board and the London Recovery Programme. I mean, definitely this sort of the concept of not just building back better, but building in resilience, and reflecting that the under sort of the big underlying challenges of the city. I mean, Ben talked about a few of them at the start. The environment, social inequality, and things. If we're to face the next set of pandemic or the next big set of crisis, we truly need to deal with those. I think one of the challenges of that, and I think there is a continued focus on it, but I think one of the challenges of it is that the others, and I think one of the presentations earlier mentioned this, the pressure of other things coming in. So even since we've had the pandemic, we've had numerous refugee crisis, which put huge strains on Kim and colleagues in boroughs, for example, to manage those. We've had Ukraine, cost of living crisis. So it's how you manage to keep a long-term focus whilst also having enough capacity to deal with these other things that come in very, very quickly. And I think that is that goes beyond political terms. It goes beyond governments, short-term political cycles and things. That is a conversation I think the cities themselves need to have it keep coming back to and keep thinking about, because otherwise it does tend to get quite lost. And that capacity is going to be so key for the next 5, 10 years.
Thank you very much. And I see Michelle Reeves from the Greater London Authority. Would you like to come in? I can see your hand.
Hi, thanks, Carla. Hi, everyone. I'm Head of Strategy at the GLA. Just wanted to follow on from Luke, really. And I think about this issue around this tension between having to deal with the sort of immediate or the short-term recovery, but also having that eye to the long-term, transformation, if you like, or reimagining of the cities. And I think one of the things that over this period, I think that can help us, I think, is to really try and identify what are the various policy enablers. So those long-term enablers that are gonna, you know, when you align them together, actually give you that multiplier effect. So when you integrate them, they are mutually reinforcing. And so some of those things I think that we've discovered in London have been, you know, the importance of data as a public good. And you know what you can do with that data, you know, not only in terms of things, you know, what we've been able to do very effectively is like things like monitoring the, you know, the growth of footfall over the period, but actually that has become, you know, I think possibly to paraphrase, I think previously maybe data was seen as the place for geeks, you know, but now I think there's this general recognition about the importance of evidence, the importance of data and what it can actually help you do. And it certainly has helped us to provide that sort of almost like just-in-time intelligence and insight that has allowed us to take the iterative approach to recovery that I think Debbie was talking about earlier. So I think identifying what those long-term policy enablers are, data, digital strategy, evidence is really important. I think Marie-Christiane talked about governance and convening power. Again, I think I've been, you know, being shown to be really, really important, and working, you know, bringing together that coalition of the willing and identifying the sort of key nodes really, or the key platforms where you can bring those different voices together to have a sort of coherent approach. I think finance obviously is one of them. I think we've heard earlier from Ben and others about the crisis impacting, for example, on previous things like public transport models, etc. You know, that break between sort of, you know, footfall and sort of travel demand and economy, and you know, we don't quite know what that's going to look like in terms of how how hybrid working is going to go. But I think it does require a rethink of those previous sort of economic models. And I think I think this whole point about sort of, certainly for us, I mean, obviously, I think in Europe, they do have more federated governance than we have, certainly in the UK. But I think that, you know, whether it's formal or informal, I think that is the model that we are moving towards in terms of that co-production, that sort of working with partners and sort of, I suppose, having that really intelligent conversation about, you know, what are our respective levers and powers, and where in that sort of ecosystem, you know, who is best placed to do what, and sort of respecting that, but recognizing that. And I think that is very, very welcome. It's very early. And I think the signs are very good in the sense of there is huge political will, and almost like this experiment of recovery has enabled us to sort of forge these new partnerships, this new collaboration, just, you know, because we have had to, but actually it is starting to take root. I think the big challenge for us now really is about, one, keeping that long-term perspective, and identifying those key enablers which will enable transformation, and aligning those and bringing those together and integrating them. So when you talk about decarbonisation, you're also talking about a just transition. You're focusing on, so in some ways it requires more precision in looking at the things that we think are going to have the most impact, but also I think because we've got a number of different partners coming together, players coming together, I think that we should look at those things that are going to be most impactful, but also the things that are going to be most scalable. So, you know, so that we actually, rather than creating a plethora of lots of different initiatives, that we really, really are precise and be much more focused about, okay, these are the things that are going to have the most impact. Let's coalesce around those. Let's lose our collective, you know, levers and powers and resources around those particular things to then get that scale, you know, scale of development and transformation, I think.
Excellent, thank you very much. I realize we are almost at time. We have 1 minute before the sort of scheduled end of the session. And I know that we still have some questions in the chat. I don't know, I'm looking at a timekeeper to wave at me to tell me yes or no, because I'm keen to at least take one more question across each of our panelists. Nobody's waving at me to stop. Of course, people, if you do need to drop off on the hour, do of course feel free to, and we will be in touch after this event with any follow up. So yes, I've been given the go ahead to take one more question. So apologies, Ben, we are going to go back to your question that's been in the chat for some time. I'm going to rephrase it very slightly just in light of the panel that we have with us. But I'm curious to hear from everybody. Are there resources that yourself as a city leader or in your work with city leaders that you found particularly useful in thinking through the recovery approach? They might be things from academia, they might be cultural aspects. Yeah, ultimately, where did you get your inspiration and support from? So it would be wonderful to hear briefly from all of our panelists on that question.
If I may, Carla, because I'll need to drop off soon, but I think the inspiration for me as we work with city leaders is to see how much they want to go forward with recovery, that they still, sometimes they do get discouraged, but they do have the energy to do this. And I think as an academic with the tools that we have, I think for us, we need to encourage them and help them work with some scientific tools to maintain that and help to their recovery, also with the tools that we have.
Excellent, thank you.
I think what's important for us in Helsinki, we want to keep the basic. We should not forget that actually if we have the basic in our services, the resources are in a good level, that's already a good situation for us. And then I think it's really important for us to have really targeted services where we need the most support. We should give the support there, even if it's a schools or different areas of our city. I think just to make also kind of understand that we don't have a lot of amount of resources. So it's important for us to also make decisions and put there where the need is actually the most at the moment. But the basic is important. We have to keep the basic.
Thank you very much. And sorry, Dimitri, were you about to jump in?
Yeah, I think that one relevant part of the learning process that we had is that more or less many cities acted in the same way at a very fast pace. And I think that this is something unique. We used to copy each other. We used to get inspired by other cities. I think this kind of competition, challenge, and collaboration, kind of mix among the different cities is incredibly helpful. But here everything was accelerated. And if the pandemic could have been a test to face the climate crisis, that would be a great point from where to start for the future. And so I think the collaboration and the inspiration among the different cities should not stop with and the sense of urgency shouldn't stop with the end of the pandemic or with a new start, or how I want to call it. I hate all the different definitions of it, which is not a better normality. But we should keep the accelerator on and really try to face the other crises that we are always leaving on the corner. And we don't feel urgency for that, but it's coming and we feel it and we experience it every day.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Luke, final word.
Oh God. Well, look, so I'll be very brief. Look, I think there are two things which did work and one that didn't. The first is, particularly in the early phases, a lot of community engagement. Even in a city the size of London, you're using the tools you have to engage with the communities, even at times that could be hard and frustrating, but that was definitely important. That kind of early work was really important. Second thing which is really important to us is kind of learning to go where the energy is and building coalitions of willing in a city the size of London. We're not going to take everyone with us, and being comfortable with saying, some people are good enough is good enough. And then the final thing that didn't work is, there is a clear structure for managing a crisis within a city, the stages that you go through to deal with something which blows up in a very big way, and that you need a kind of multi-agency response. The kind of the recovery processes that we had in place for dealing with a city issue just weren't relevant to recovery, not least because of the length of time the recovery from COVID went on. And I think there is something to learn about how how we kind of a bit more sophisticated in kind of our multi-agency kind of immediate response, and how you move into this kind of work. So I think they are the two things that really work. The one thing that has driven me up the wall has been the final.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, so we will draw to a close just now. I know we've gone a few minutes over, and apologies, I know we're much reduced, but thank you so much to everybody for sticking with us until the end. And as I say, just very, very briefly, we will be producing a summary of this event, so keep an eye out for that, and we will make sure that is distributed. We do have another event coming up very, very soon by we, I mean IFO, the International Public Policy Observatory. So on the 17th of June, you can join us for an event on NHS staff wellbeing, what works and the case for investment. But IFO and IFO cities have regular events. We also have lots of different interesting materials that we've produced around the topics we're discussing. So please do keep in touch, basically, and you can check that out. We are at COVID and Society on Twitter, and our website is also COVID and Society, so we can drop that in the chat. But yeah, thank you again to everybody. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everybody who attended.